Hello there, and welcome to Dream Past Diaries. I'm truly glad you've made it here. Maybe it's been a long day, or maybe you're the kind of dreamer who prefers to drift off to the sound of quiet thoughts and forgotten mysteries instead of counting sheep. Either way, tonight's story is yours to enjoy. You don't have to do anything now, just rest. Let your thoughts slow, your breath deepen, and your body grow lighter, as if gravity itself has begun to fade away. In the slow dimness of a medieval dawn, when the mists still clung to the castle stones, and the air smelled faintly of dew and old wood, the life of a king began not with the fanfare of trumpets, but with the quiet creak of shutters and the whispered shuffle of servants preparing the day's first light. The king, still heavy with sleep, lay within chambers vast and draughty, where thick curtains of velvet hung like night itself, and the faint scent of beeswax from the dying candles lingered above the tapestries. His awakening was never abrupt, for life in the Middle Ages flowed like the turning of the seasons, slow, deliberate, and wrapped in ceremony. A servant, chosen for silence and steadiness, would open the window just enough to let in the gray morning. Another would kneel beside the bed, murmuring soft words in Latin or French, whichever tongue the court had adopted in its endless imitation of older, grander empires. The king would stir slightly, not out of eagerness, but out of the slow habit of power. For even his slowness was an act of authority. Time itself seemed to wait upon him. When his eyes opened, they did not seek the world, but observed the ceiling. Carved beams, darkened by age and smoke, where cobwebs shone faintly like threads of silver. There was a calmness in his breathing, a rhythm of someone who lived not in haste but in ritual. The attendants moved with reverence, their footsteps, muffled by thick rushes, scattered anew every few days to freshen the air, though the scent of straw and damp earth always lingered. Before the king spoke, his chamberlain approached with a silver basin filled with cold water drawn from the courtyard. The metal was polished to a dull gleam, the surface of the water trembling as though reluctant to be disturbed. The king would dip his fingers, sometimes merely touching the surface, feeling the bite of cold as if it connected him again to the world of men beyond dreams. It was not cleanliness that the gesture represented. It was continuity, a daily baptism into his own role, reaffirming his station as the vessel of divine order. The chamber around him was layered with history, tapestries depicting saints, battles, and fables, their colors softened by time. Chairs carved from oak whose arms bore the faint polish of countless hands. A hearth perpetually fed with logs, for even in summer the stone walls kept a chill that no fire fully dispelled. Servants moved through this world as shadows of function. One arranged the king's robe, another carried in his garments for the day linen first, then wool, then the soft fur-lined tunic for warmth, all selected not for comfort but for symbol. Dressing the king was an act of hierarchy. Each layer represented a circle of the world, the body beneath symbolizing mortality, the cloth above representing dominion. The king rarely spoke as they worked. His mind drifted in that fog of half-thoughts, where duties, dreams, and memories merged like threads in a tapestry. He might recall a hunt from years past, or the face of a queen now gone, or perhaps the low chant of monks he'd once heard at dawn. reminding him that kings too must answer to eternity. Breakfast was an affair of formality. Though modest by royal standards, a small loaf of yesterday's bread, slightly warmed, a slice of salted fish, or cold meat from the night before, a cup of watered wine, and sometimes a small pear preserved in honey. Yet even this simple meal unfolded like a ritual. Each item was presented in order, each tasted only after the taster, a trusted servant, had tried it first, a quiet reminder that the privileges of royalty carried unseen dangers. Poison was not an everyday fear, but an ever-present ghost that haunted the silver plates and golden cups of medieval life. The king ate slowly, as if aware that his every movement represented the pace of his realm. He was watched, not for curiosity, but for rhythm. When the king lifted his cup, others might do so. When he paused, silence followed. Even the sound of his chewing was part of the morning's order, a sign that life continued according to its unspoken script. Once the meal was done, the king would sit beside the hearth while clerks entered, carrying rolls of parchment and wax tablets. The day's petitions awaited him, the endless murmuring business of lands and taxes, quarrels between nobles, disputes over boundaries, and the granting of privileges. But before any word of governance was spoken, the priest or confessor entered, robed in black or brown, carrying with him a faint scent of incense and ink. The conversation between the two men was soft, almost a prayer disguised as counsel. The king might ask not for forgiveness, but for interpretation. What did this omen mean? What did this dream suggest? What passage of scripture could guide his decision about a rebellious vassal or a poor man's plea? The confessor would respond with the slow cadence of the educated, quoting phrases from Augustine or the Psalms, their Latin syllables rolling like waves against the king's patience. And thus, the morning's governance began not with decrees, but with contemplation. Beyond the window, the castle stirred. Cooks prepared the midday meal. Guards rotated their posts. Pages swept the courtyard and fed the hounds. The distant sound of the blacksmith's hammer echoed faintly, steady and monotonous, like the heartbeat of the realm itself. The king would hear it without truly listening, his thoughts wandering between the weight of the crown and the heaviness of his own solitude. He was surrounded by people, yet alone in essence. His courtiers bowed deeply, yet their eyes flickered with ambition. His wife, if she lived, played her role with quiet dignity, surrounded by ladies who embroidered and whispered of family alliances. Children, legitimate or otherwise, were cared for by wet nurses and tutors who molded them into future pieces of the great political board. Every person in his world had a place, and every place existed to reflect his image. Yet within that reflection, the king sometimes saw a blur, the uncertain outline of the man he might have been, if not for the accident of birth. By late morning, the king would make his procession to the chapel. The passage from his chamber to the sacred space was long and lined with portraits of ancestors, grim faces in faded paint, their eyes fixed forever on him, as if reminding him of the unbroken chain he must uphold. The sound of his steps echoed along the corridor, a rhythm of power and weariness. In the chapel, candles burned, even in daylight, casting their flicker across the stone arches. The scent of frankincense filled the air, mingling with the faint odor of damp limestone. The king knelt, not as a man seeking grace, but as a ruler confirming his legitimacy before heaven. The priest's voice rose and fell, reading from texts older than the kingdom itself. The Latin words washed over him like rain, unintelligible yet cleansing, monotonous yet reassuring. Around him, the air trembled with stillness. It was in such moments, between the chant and the silence, that the king felt both infinite and forgotten. After the service, the procession reversed, slow steps back through corridors, lined with servants who bowed and vanished like ghosts. The sun, now higher, filtered through the narrow windows in golden slants, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily, unhurried as time itself. The king would pause sometimes to look out over the courtyard, the stables, the drawbridge, the small garden tended by monks. He would note the way the smoke curled from the kitchen chimney, or the way a horse stamped its hoof impatiently in the cold. These were his domains, not just lands and armies, but moments, textures, sensations. His reign existed as much in the repetition of mornings as in the recording of conquests. Every dawn reaffirmed his reality. He was king not because he ruled, but because the world moved around him in endless ceremonial rhythm. By noon, the business of the realm began. Councils, reports, and arguments presented with elaborate bows and cautious words. Yet even in these affairs, the same dreamlike pace persisted. No decision was made quickly. No voice was raised sharply. The rhythm of medieval governance was glacial, one matter leading into another, papers sealed, words written in thick ink that took minutes to dry. The king listened more than he spoke, his silence often more powerful than any command. To be royal was to embody patience, to exist in a state of perpetual consideration. When the meeting ended, he would retreat once more into his chambers, where quiet awaited him like an old companion. And thus, as afternoon approached, the castle seemed to breathe a long, slow exhalation of continuity. Outside, the villagers tilled the fields, unaware of the intricate rituals occurring above them. Inside, the king sat by the fire once more, his hands clasped, eyes half closed. The morning had passed, not with drama, but with the stillness of routine, the slow, eternal heartbeat of monarchy. His crown, resting on a small table beside him, glimmered faintly in the dim light, less an ornament of glory than a burden of constancy. For in this world of slow mornings and sacred gestures, the king's greatest act was not conquest or command, it was persistence, the quiet endurance of one who carried the weight of centuries in every calm, measured breath. The hours after noon in a medieval castle moved with the slow rhythm of a pendulum, each moment suspended between sunlight and shadow, noise and silence, life and ritual. When the bells from the chapel marked the 12th hour, their sound rolled softly through the corridors, mingling with the faint clatter of wooden bowls in the kitchens and the muted murmur of servants crossing the great hall. The king, having finished his morning councils, would retire for the midday meal, not in solitude, but amid a carefully arranged company of nobles and attendants, whose presence was chosen as much for symbolism as for companionship. The dining hall itself was vast and echoing, its walls lined with tapestries depicting scenes of hunting and harvest. Their woven threads faded to soft earth tones over generations. At the center stretched the great table of oak, scarred by time yet polished to a low, waxy sheen. Light from the high windows poured across the table like slow honey, illuminating the pewter dishes, the wooden trenchers, and the small silver goblets that reflected the flicker of candles, even in daylight. The air was filled with the mingling aromas of roasted meat, spiced wine, and warm bread, simple scents that, in their combination, carried the suggestion of continuity and order. The king's seat was slightly raised, not so high as to appear grandiose, but enough that all others naturally faced him when they spoke. He rarely smiled. The expression of a ruler was not meant to betray amusement, but to embody composure. Before him lay a modest spread by royal measure, perhaps a roasted pheasant, a bowl of lentils, a small loaf of white bread, and a goblet of diluted claret. The portions were never excessive, for gluttony was a sin frowned upon by both priest and physician. Beside the king stood his cupbearer, a man of quiet dignity who tasted each sip before passing the goblet, ensuring both safety and ceremony. Around the table, the courtiers murmured in low voices, conversing about hunting plans, the weather, the yield of crops, or the latest marriages among noble families. Every conversation was a kind of theater, full of pauses and politeness, designed less for exchange than for the maintenance of hierarchy. Servants moved between the benches, carrying platters of steaming food, filling cups, collecting bones, and offering thin napkins of linen. Their footsteps echoed softly, like the rustle of dry leaves on a windless day. The king listened to the talk as one listens to rain, not for meaning, but for rhythm. When the meal ended, a page read aloud a passage from a devotional text, perhaps from Boethius or a psalm, a reminder that even in feasting, the soul must not forget the weight of eternity. The king inclined his head, and the hall fell silent. The faint scratching of quills could be heard as the scribes, seated at the far end of the room, recorded the attendance of lords, the gifts exchanged, and the small decrees issued even during lunch. In such details lay the machinery of monarchy, not in battles or coronations, but in endless documentation. When the reading ended, the king rose, signaling the dispersal of the court. The company stood as one, bowing slightly as he departed through the archway that led toward the private gardens. The transition from hall to open air was like moving between worlds, from the scent of meat and wax to the crisp sweetness of grass and distant flowers. Here, in the walled garden, the pace of time slowed further still. Bees drifted lazily from blossom to blossom. Doves cooed from the tower ledges. The sound of a distant fountain provided a constant, gentle accompaniment to thought. The king would walk with a small retinue, perhaps a chaplain, a steward, and one trusted advisor. Their talk was soft, restrained, often fragmentary. They spoke of the season's harvest, of rumors from the provinces, of the next pilgrimage some knight intended to make. Yet beneath the surface of such ordinary topics flowed a current of formality that none dared break. Even in the quiet of the garden, the presence of majesty demanded silence as much as speech. Sometimes the king would pause beside a statue or a rose bush, his hand brushing the petals without truly touching them, as if uncertain whether the world outside ceremony could still be real. The air was warm, and the faint hum of insects created a drowsy monotone that seemed to seep into every stone of the castle walls. This was the hour when time itself seemed to nod, when even the guards at the gate stood a little heavier on their feet. and the dogs dozed in the shade of the stables. By mid-afternoon, the king often returned indoors to his solar, a smaller, sunlit room adjoining his private chambers. The room smelled faintly of parchment and lavender, with a large window overlooking the courtyard. Here, his clerks awaited with scrolls and ledgers. The afternoon was devoted to governance, charters to sign, disputes to settle, letters to dictate. The clerks sat at narrow tables, their quills scratching softly like the whispering of moths. Wax seals lay ready beside small brass lamps, the red and gold colors gleaming faintly in the light. Each document was an act of permanence, each signature an affirmation that the world would remain as it had been that morning. The king spoke rarely, preferring to gesture. When he did speak, his words were measured, slow, deliberate, as if the air itself must absorb their weight. A petition might concern a quarrel over a strip of farmland. Another might request permission to hold a fair. Another might beg pardon for a debt unpaid. The clerks read each aloud, their voices careful and emotionless. The king listened, occasionally tracing a pattern on the armrest of his chair, his gaze distant. Such afternoons could stretch endlessly, punctuated only by the scratching of pens and the low cough of an aging servant. The monotony was not unpleasant. It was the sound of order, the steady murmur of a kingdom functioning as it should. When his attention waned, the king would rise and step to the window. Below, he could see the courtyard alive with subtle motion, squires training with blunted swords, a washerwoman hanging linens near the well, a horse being brushed until its coat shone like amber in the sunlight. The scene was timeless, repetitive, yet strangely soothing. Life within the castle was a circle of gestures repeated without end. Feeding, cleaning, guarding, praying. Even the air seemed shaped by habit, filled with the soft echoes of footsteps and the faint chiming of distant bells. Occasionally, a breeze would lift the banners on the towers, revealing the faded colors of the royal arms, their fabric fluttering like the memory of glory rather than its presence. Watching all this, the king would feel a kind of peace that was neither joy nor contentment, but a resignation to continuity, a sense that the world existed, less to be changed than to be maintained. As the sun lowered slightly, casting long beams through the high windows, musicians sometimes entered the solar. They were few, perhaps a lute player, a flautist, and a singer whose voice was low and unadorned. The music they made was slow, almost static, built from repeating patterns that drifted through the air like a faint perfume. The king listened with half-closed eyes, not so much hearing as absorbing. The melodies had no beginning or end. They simply existed, like the hum of bees or the turning of water in a fountain. Around him, courtiers remained still, each aware that even the act of listening in the presence of the king was part of the ceremony. When the final note faded, there was no applause, only silence, that deep, collective stillness that belongs to old stone halls where history and sound sleep side by side. Later, the confessor or chronicler might arrive, carrying notes from earlier discussions. They would read to the king what had been recorded that day, small matters of law, exchanges of land, proclamations drafted for approval. The words, though important, were read in a tone so level and unhurried that they became like the ticking of an unseen clock. The king nodded occasionally, his eyelids heavy, his thoughts already dissolving into abstraction. The monotony of governance was both his duty and his solace. To rule was to drift through endless documentation, through words that would outlast his voice and yet mean the same in any age given under our hand. In the year of our Lord, the pattern of such phrases soothed him. They promised continuity. They turned the chaos of life into lines of ink that would remain even after he was dust by the late afternoon. The work would cease. The sunlight had turned amber now, and long shadows crept across the room, reaching like fingers over the rolls of parchment and the silver ink pots. Servants entered quietly to clear the tables, their movements practiced and soundless. The king would rise, stretching his limbs slightly, an indulgence permitted only in privacy. He would then move toward the west-facing window, where the view opened over forests and distant fields. The horizon glowed faintly, the light caught in the thin mist rising from the river. For a moment, he would stand there motionless, gazing at the vastness of his realm, not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker of stillness. The murmurs of the day faded behind him, the scratching of pens, the rustle of robes, the soft exhale of a candle being snuffed out. Everything seemed to dissolve into that single golden silence. And so, the afternoon of a medieval king passed not in splendor or excitement, but in repetition, meals, meetings, writings, music, and thought, all blending into the same gentle hum of existence. His life, though surrounded by ceremony, was, in truth, a study in quiet endurance, a slow dance between solitude and responsibility. The world outside might change with the turn of seasons, but within these walls, time drifted. When the sun began to sink behind the western woods, its light turned the gray stones of the castle to a soft amber, and the long corridors filled with a tired glow that seemed to come not from the sun itself, but from centuries of quiet evenings like this one, repeated and remembered by the walls. The sound of distant bells marked the changing of watches, and the faint cries of workers in the courtyard faded as gates were drawn shut and torches lit along the battlements. Inside, the king rose from his chair, the weight of the day pressing upon his shoulders in a way that was less burden than ritual fatigue, the kind that comes not from exertion, but from the slow constancy of command. His footsteps, muffled by the woven rushes on the floor, echoed softly down the corridor leading to his private hall. Servants followed, carrying candles that trembled faintly with each breath of air. Their light wavered across the walls, catching on the edges of tapestries and the dull gleam of metal sconces, making the castle appear alive with gentle motion. The faint murmur of their movement was the same every evening, the shuffle of slippers, the faint clink of metal plates being stacked, the rustle of fabric, and it created a rhythm that lulled the mind into the same calm repetition that governed all things within these walls. The great hall was no longer filled with courtiers and music. It was quieter now, though not empty. Pages moved about the tables, arranging benches, setting down cups, laying out simple foods for the evening meal. The smell of stewed vegetables, roasted meat, and warm ale mingled with the wax of candles until the entire space seemed perfumed with domestic routine. The king took his place at the same long table where he had sat at midday, but the atmosphere was gentler now. The windows were dark, reflecting the candlelight back into the room like a pool of liquid gold. Around him gathered a smaller company, the the seneschal, the chaplain, the physician, and a few trusted knights. Their conversation flowed in the slow, deliberate way of men who have said the same things many times before. About the weather, the condition of roads, the repair of stables, or the health of the queen's roses in the garden. Each remark was offered like a pebble dropped into still water, creating soft ripples that vanished almost before they began. The king listened, his hand resting lightly on the table, his gaze occasionally wandering toward the fire where logs burned with a low, even crackle. The fire was the true center of the evening. Its glow softened the hard lines of armor and stone, painting everything in shades of orange and shadow. The smell of smoke mingled with the faint scent of spices that lingered from the kitchen. Every few moments, a servant would step forward to add another log, bowing silently before retreating into the dark edges of the hall. The king found comfort in the small ceremonies of flame, the way it consumed the wood so patiently, the way it spoke in whispers rather than roars, the way its light shimmered on the metal goblets, turning them into mirrors of a world that never quite stood still. Around the table, the courtiers ate slowly, in measured bites, as though the act of eating were itself a prayer of gratitude for the uneventful day. A minstrel sat by the hearth, plucking a lute, not to entertain, but to fill the space between words with sound. His tune soft and circular, more sigh than melody. The air grew thick with calm. After the meal, the king rose, and the courtiers stood as one. The transition from dining to repose was seamless, practiced through years of habit. Together, they moved toward the adjoining chamber, known as the withdrawing room, where the evening's quieter hours unfolded. Here, the air was cooler, touched by the faint scent of herbs hung to dry in the rafters. Candles burned lower now, their light diffused through thin smoke. The walls were lined with shelves of scrolls and a few precious books, copied painstakingly by monks whose names were long forgotten. The king took his seat near the fire, while a servant poured warm wine into a cup carved with faded symbols of his lineage. This was the hour for reflection, for listening to readings, or for idle discourse that drifted like smoke through the air. The chaplain might open a book and read from the chronicles, tales of past kings, of victories long turned to dust, of the founding of monasteries, of gifts made to the poor. His voice was low and even, each syllable sliding into the next without emphasis or pause, until the story became less a narrative than a rhythm of words. The king closed his eyes sometimes, not from weariness, but from the soft pleasure of hearing the past spoken into existence. In another corner of the room, the physician examined a small glass vial of herbs, explaining quietly to a young page the properties of mint, rue, and valerian, how they eased the stomach or calmed the mind. The page listened intently, though his eyes often wandered toward the fire, mesmerized by its slow, living movement. The murmur of their conversation blended with the faint scrape of a quill as one of the clerks recorded the events of the day, the petitions answered, the visitors received, the letters dispatched. Every entry began the same way, in Latin, formal and exact, the date, the hour, the names. The scratching of the pen was a kind of music, dry and constant. Outside, the wind rose gently, brushing against the shutters like a cautious visitor. It carried with it the scent of the river and the far-off smoke of cottages, reminders that beyond the castle's stillness, Other lives moved in their own slow patterns, peasants finishing their suppers, dogs barking at the dark, monks chanting the night prayers in distant cloisters. As darkness deepened, servants entered again, now carrying torches and small trays with slices of fruit, a bowl of honey, and warm spiced milk. The king took a sip, his mind half anchored in the moment, half drifting toward memory. The talk in the room softened until it became a near silence, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the hearth. Someone, perhaps the steward, recited a few lines of verse, not love poetry or heroism, but something about the turning of seasons, the patience of the earth, the way frost returns and melts again. The words had been spoken many times before, and that was their comfort. In repetition lay the assurance that the world remained as it always had. The king's gaze wandered to the windows, where he could see his reflection superimposed upon the night beyond, a faint double image of candlelight and stars. For a long moment he simply watched, neither thinking nor dreaming, only existing within the stillness. Eventually, the courtiers withdrew one by one, bowing silently before leaving the chamber. The king remained alone, save for a single servant and the ever-faithful dog that lay curled at his feet. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing red and steady. The room seemed to breathe around him, the air expanding and contracting with the slow rhythm of heat and shadow. He thought of nothing particular, perhaps of the fields in summer, or the sound of rain against the leaded windows, or the smell of new parchment when a treaty was signed. His mind drifted among such images without direction, like a leaf carried by a slow-moving stream. The servant, seeing his master's stillness, approached quietly and asked if he wished to retire. The king nodded, and together they moved through the corridor toward his bedchamber. The bed awaited like a small island of fabric amid the vastness of the room. Its canopy was heavy with embroidered scenes of saints and vines, its sheets cool to the touch. Candles burned low on the table beside it, their flames bending in the faint draughts that moved through the chamber. The servant removed the outer garments with care, folded them, and placed them upon the chest at the foot of the bed. Then, with the same ceremony repeated countless times before, he poured water from a silver jug into a basin, allowing the sound to fill the silence like a brief song. The king washed his hands, his movements slow and mechanical, and then sank into the bed, the linen rustling faintly beneath him. The servant extinguished the candles, one by one, until only a single flame remained. Shadows climbed the walls like gentle smoke. The king closed his eyes, not quite asleep, but sinking into the half-world between thought and rest. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Somewhere, a watchman's voice called the hour. The castle, too, seemed to breathe now, alive with the deep rhythm of night. And thus the evening ended as it always did, not with finality, but with continuation. The same routines that had unfolded that day would unfold again tomorrow and the day after, as they had for generations. The castle was a machine of repetition, a vessel through which time passed without truly changing. The king, within it, was less a man than a symbol of endurance, an embodiment of the unbroken stillness that defined his realm. The fire dwindled to ash, the dog sighed in its sleep, and beyond the shuttered windows the stars wheeled slowly above the quiet land, ancient and patient, watching over a world that dreamed in silence. When the final light of evening faded from the high arched windows of the castle hall, and the long shadows of the stone pillars grew faint and uncertain in the flickering glow of torches, the great palace sank gradually into the kind of stillness that seemed to stretch time itself into a long and dreamlike procession of quiet hours, where every sound was a whisper and every movement a murmur upon the endless hush of the night. For in the royal household, the hours after the final meal were not marked by merriment or excitement, but by a deliberate, almost sacred calm that descended upon every corridor, every stairway, every distant chamber, as though the entire structure of the palace were preparing to fall asleep with its king. Servants moved slowly through the dim corridors, their slippered feet barely making a sound upon the worn stones, carrying the faint light of their small oil lamps that trembled and danced along the walls as they passed, casting delicate patterns of shadow over tapestries that told stories of forgotten wars, pilgrimages, and ancient lineages that few alive could recall. In the royal bedchamber, heavy curtains were drawn over the high windows, shutting out the chill air of the night, and the bed itself an enormous thing carved of dark oak and covered in layers of wool, linen, and fur was being prepared for the king's rest with careful, almost ceremonial precision. The chamber servants would plump the cushions and smooth the sheets, their movements practiced through repetition, their faces quiet with the resignation of habit. Candles were trimmed, the coals in the brazier stirred, steady heat, and then, one by one, the attendants withdrew, bowing low as they backed out of the room, leaving only the faint scent of beeswax and smoke behind them. The king would enter slowly, often already half weary from the long rituals of the Datha, endless audiences, the quiet meals taken beneath the carved ceiling of the great hall, the signing of decrees, whose words he might not even remember, and he would sit in silence for a long time before disrobing, as if unwilling to let go of consciousness too quickly, unwilling to surrender to the silence that awaited him behind the bed curtains. The chamberlain would remove the crown from his head with the same reverent precision used to lift a relic from an altar, and place it upon a low table where it gleamed faintly in the candlelight, an object that was both a symbol and a burden, too heavy to wear even in dreams. When at last the king lay down, he would listen to the faint, repetitive sounds of the castle as it continued to breathe through the night, the distant echo of a door closing in a servant's passage, the low murmur of voices from the guardroom, the steady, rhythmic creak of the old timbers in the ceiling above. These were the nocturnal hymns of the palace, the slow music of stone and wood and wind. Beyond the walls, the courtyard slept beneath a thin mist. The fountain that splashed so gently during the day now whispered with softer streams, and the moonlight spread itself upon the surface of the water like a trembling hand. The horses in the royal stables shifted occasionally, their hooves tapping faintly upon straw, and the watchmen on the walls paced slowly, their armor catching brief glints of light as they turned their heads toward the silent horizon. All through the night, these small motions continued, the pulse of a living structure that seemed itself to dream, to think, to remember. Inside the castle, the air grew colder and stiller, thick with the mingled smells of extinguished wax and damp stone. The torches along the great stair were reduced to faint orange coals, and the silence deepened until even the sound of the wind outside the shutters seemed like a deliberate intrusion. The few who still moved through the palace at this hour, scribes finishing a document by lamplight, servants checking the locks, or the physician preparing his quiet remedies, did so with bowed heads and careful steps, as though afraid to disturb the long, invisible rhythm that governed the sleeping world of royalty. Even in slumber, there was ritual. Even in stillness, there was hierarchy. The king slept upon embroidered pillows, while below, in narrow beds along the servants' hall, those who served him dreamed beneath coarse blankets of wool, their dreams filled with fragments of the day's labor, the glint of a goblet, the smell of the kitchen fires, the rustle of silken robes in the hallway. Time itself seemed slower in those hours, and in the pale depths of night, the palace became a kind of echo chamber for thought. The king, half asleep, would sometimes awaken and hear the faint tolling of a distant bell, marking another hour gone, and he would think, though only dimly, of how many nights he had spent like this, and how many more might pass before his reign was done. Outside his chamber, the stars moved invisibly through the mist, and the world turned without haste or noise. The chamberlain, sleeping in the adjoining room, dreamed of ink and parchment. The guards dreamed of their spears and the cold stones beneath their boots. The maids dreamed of sunlight, though none could say why. The stillness thickened layer upon layer, until it seemed that dawn might never come, but always, at some imperceptible moment, the first faint breath of morning began to creep along the high windows, the merest whisper of gray in the darkness. The cocks in the far village below would stir, though their cries were still muted by distance. The fires in the kitchen hearths would be stoked once more, and the invisible machinery of the day would begin to hum beneath the quiet surface of the palace. Yet, in these final hours of the night, when the king still slept and the corridors still glowed with only the faintest traces of fading candles, there existed a peace that no decree could summon. No ceremony could duplicate the peace of exhaustion, of repetition, of the steady cycle that had governed palace life for centuries. It was a peace that belonged not only to kings, but to walls, to furniture, to time itself. As dawn approached, the king might stir once more, half caught between sleep and waking, and the memories of his dreams would drift like smoke through his thoughts. He might dream of processions through silent streets, of faces half remembered, of the sound of banners in the wind. He might dream of nothing at all. The candles guttered one last time, and the cold light of dawn touched the edge of the curtain. The palace, sensing morning's return, seemed to breathe again. The morning in the medieval palace came not with haste, but with the gradual unfolding of light, like a memory returning after a long slumber, pale and delicate, filtering first through the narrow slits of the high windows before it touched the cold flagstones and began its slow ascent toward the carved beams above. The air still held the faint chill of the night, and the soft crackle of rekindled fires in distant hearths echoed faintly through the hallways, blending with the quiet footsteps of servants who began their endless cycle of duties once again. Morning was not merely the start of a new day, but a continuation of the rhythm that had pulsed through the palace for centuries, a rhythm of rising, dressing, preparing, serving, writing, and waiting. In those hours before the king himself awoke, the palace existed in a kind of hush, as if the entire building held its breath in reverence for the first light. The torches that had burned through the night were extinguished one by one, leaving small trails of smoke that curled upward and vanished, and the faint scent of wax and soot mingled with the smell of baking bread wafting from the kitchens below in the servants' quarters. The slow murmur of conversation began, subdued, punctuated by yawns and the clinking of wooden spoons against iron pots. Water was drawn from wells, carried in heavy pails through narrow corridors that glistened faintly with moisture, and poured into copper basins to be warmed for the royal household's use. Laundry was fetched from its place by the hearth, folded and carried in baskets of woven reeds, each garment labeled and remembered as part of a hierarchy so intricate that even the most ordinary tunic had its designated rank. The kitchen, the true heart of the early palace, stirred to life with a kind of sacred repetition. Bread dough kneaded rhythmically on wooden boards, meat turning slowly on spits over low fires, herbs crushed beneath pestles in stone mortar. Each sound, though small, belonged to a greater symphony of routine, a music of necessity and habit that accompanied the dawn of every royal day. Meanwhile, above these quieter depths, the king's personal attendants prepared the royal chambers for his awakening. Curtains were drawn back slightly to allow the light to enter without disturbing his rest, and the fire in the hearth was stoked until it glowed with steady warmth. The scent of rosemary and thyme, sprinkled upon the floorboards the evening before, lingered softly in the air. The garments laid out for the day's duties, doublets of wool and silk, hose of fine weave, and the heavy mantle embroidered with the royal crest, rested upon a long chest near the bed. Everything awaited the slow, deliberate process of dressing the king, a ritual that could last nearly an hour, conducted in silence, save for the rustle of fabric and the occasional creak of leather, belts being fastened when the king finally stirred, opening his eyes to the muted glow of morning. His first sight was often the gentle movement of dust in the sunlight, the slow dance of tiny motes floating like ghosts above his bed. He would lie still for some minutes, his mind slowly disentangling from the threads of dreams, and in that half-awake state, he would feel not like a ruler, but like a man adrift in the quiet sea of time. It was then that the chamberlain would enter, bowing low, to announce the beginning of the day. The sound of his voice, formal, soft, and practiced, marked the true dawn of the kingdom. For from that moment forward, every task, every conversation, every gesture within the castle took on the orderly rhythm dictated by the king's presence. The ritual of dressing was not merely practical, but symbolic, a daily reaffirmation of status and continuity. Each layer of clothing added weight not only to the body but to the soul, each fastening and fold reminding the monarch of the expectations that bound him. The servants moved like shadows, lifting sleeves, smoothing fabric, tying cords, adjusting clasps, and presenting the polished mirror of bronze or silver in which the king might glance briefly at his reflection, not to admire, but to acknowledge the face that must bear authority for another day. The light in the chamber grew brighter as the sun climbed higher, falling now upon the gilded edges of furniture, the pale stone of the floor, the delicate tracery of the window arches. The sound of bells from the nearby chapel announced the morning prayers, echoing through the corridors with a rhythm that mingled both solemnity and monotony. After dressing, the king would move to the small private chapel attached to his quarters, a narrow space with walls of cold stone softened by the glow of candles and the faint fragrance of incense. Here, the morning devotions took place, murmured Latin prayers, spoken not always with understanding but with habit, accompanied by the quiet rustle of pages and the occasional sigh of wind against the shutters. The priest, old and deliberate in his movements, read from his book in a voice that was steady but tired, while the king knelt upon the cushion provided for him, eyes half closed, mind perhaps wandering toward the tasks of the day. Religion in those moments felt less like passion and more like architecture, something built to contain time, to give shape to the emptiness of hours. When the prayers ended, the king would rise slowly, touch his lips to the crucifix, and leave through the same door by which he had entered, his footsteps echoing softly against the flagstones from the chapel. The procession of the morning continued through a series of spaces, each with its own distinct stillness: the council chamber, with its long table and rows of chairs; the gallery, where portraits of ancestors watched with painted eyes; the balcony, from which the king might look upon the mist-shrouded gardens below. These gardens, though beautiful, had their own silence, a silence of trimmed hedges, still fountains, and statues standing eternally in mid-motion. Occasionally, the king would pause at the balcony to observe the gardeners at work, their small figures bending and straightening in patient rhythm, or the slow movement of clouds reflected in the ponds. Such sights did not stir joy or sorrow, only a kind of quiet acceptance, the same feeling one might have when observing the slow turning of an hourglass. By the time the sun stood high enough to flood the main courtyard, the palace was fully awake. Pages hurried through corridors, carrying messages sealed with wax. Scribes bent over parchment, their quills scratching softly. Maids swept the floors, gathering yesterday's dust into neat piles that would be carried away to some unseen corner of the estate. The great hall, which had been empty through the night, now filled gradually with the murmur of voices and the clatter of cups being set upon long wooden tables. The air was filled with the smell of roasted grain, warm bread, and honey. The meal that followed, simple by royal standards, but lavish compared to those beyond the walls, consisted of bread, cheese, fruit preserved in syrup, and watered wine. The king ate little, often distracted by the murmur of courtiers awaiting his attention. Yet for all its ceremony, the morning was a slow affair, a series of gestures and moments repeated endlessly, year after year, until each seemed to lose its individual meaning and blend into a single, continuous pattern. The king's gaze, when it drifted toward the windows, might linger upon the distant hills where farmers were already at work in their fields, their lives ruled by a simpler, older rhythm. He would envy them sometimes, though he would never say so aloud. The courtiers would speak in low tones about matters of tribute, alliances, or disputes in far villages, and the king would listen, nodding occasionally, his thoughts drifting somewhere between the sound of their voices and the play of sunlight upon the tablecloth. The morning of a medieval king was not a time of excitement, but of slow awakening, not of body alone, but of the vast machinery of the realm that turned around him. From the kitchens to the stables, from the chapel to the tower, every person, every object, every hour had its place. The palace, once again, became a living organism, breathing in unison with its monarch. And as the sunlight deepened and the scent of warm bread lingered in the air, it seemed as though the entire world had always been and would always remain in that same state of serene repetition, a kingdom not of glory or conquest, but of endurance, where morning followed morning in an endless procession of quiet duties and soft light. By the time the sun reached its highest and most patient place above the spires and towers of the castle, a golden haze filled the courtyards, and the air itself seemed to move more slowly, as though the world had settled into a quiet pause between morning duties and evening reflections. The sound of bells from the chapel faded into silence, replaced by the soft hum of ordinary movement, the measured footfalls of courtiers crossing the long galleries, the low murmur of servants carrying trays along the corridors, the faint clinking of dishes being arranged upon polished wooden tables in the great hall. Noon was the stillest hour of the royal day, the calm midpoint of the vast, unchanging rhythm that governed palace life. It was the hour when the weight of the morning's responsibilities had already passed, and the languid serenity of the afternoon had not yet begun, when even the sunlight, falling through colored glass and open shutters, seemed content merely to rest upon surfaces, warming, not commanding, illuminating without intrusion. In the main courtyard, the flagstones were warm underfoot, and the scent of rosemary and lavender drifted upward from the herb gardens that lined the inner walls. The gardeners, working with slow precision, trimmed and watered the plants beneath the patient gaze of marble statues. The fountains murmured faintly, their streams catching the sun and scattering it into fragments of silver upon the surface of the basins. Doves cooed softly along the rooflines, their shadows gliding over the stone like passing thoughts. The king's hounds lay sleeping near the steps of the eastern wing, their sleek coats gleaming faintly as the light moved across them, while a young page, tasked with keeping watch, dozed against a pillar, his chin resting upon his chest. Every motion seemed suspended within the gentle warmth of noon, and even the passing clouds drifted more slowly, as though reluctant to disturb the perfection of that quiet balance between effort and rest. Preparations for the midday meal had reached their tranquil completion. Long tables of oak stretched beneath tapestries depicting scenes of ancient hunts and forgotten victories, their colors softened by time and smoke. Upon these tables lay gleaming platters of silver and brass, each arranged with care, though not ostentation, bread freshly baked, roasted meats seasoned with herbs, fruits preserved in honey, and pitchers of watered wine cooled in basins of spring water. The scent of these simple yet abundant offerings filled the air with a mixture of comfort and memory. Servants moved with the rhythm of habit, bowing as they passed one another, their expressions composed and distant, their gestures honed through repetition until they had become a kind of quiet choreography. The king, when he entered, was greeted not with sound, but with silence, save for the faint rustle of garments and the creak of chairs as courtiers rose to their feet. He would take his seat upon the slightly raised dais at the end of the hall, beneath a canopy of faded velvet embroidered with the royal crest, and the meal would begin, not as a moment of indulgence, but as another ritual of the day, one to be endured with grace rather than savored with appetite. The courtiers spoke in murmurs, their voices blending with the muted clatter of cutlery and the distant hum of wind beyond the windows. The topics were always the same: the weather, the harvest, the arrival of a messenger from some distant province, the slow repair of a bridge, or the condition of the roads. Their words filled the air like the ticking of a clock, steady and predictable, their tones measured to avoid offense or surprise. The king listened with a detached patience, occasionally nodding, occasionally pausing to sip from his cup, his gaze wandering from face to face as though searching for something that never quite appeared. The light in the hall shifted gradually as the meal progressed, spilling in through tall, narrow windows and casting long stripes across the flagstones. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, visible only when caught in that golden glow. The heat of the fire in the hearth had grown gentle now, maintained only for the comfort of presence rather than warmth. Outside, the clatter of hooves upon cobblestones echoed faintly from the outer courtyard, where messengers came and went in silence, their tasks as endless as the turning of the days. From the kitchens, the faint sounds of washing, the splash of water, the scrape of iron pots carried upward through the walls, blending seamlessly into the calm of the hall. There was no laughter, no music, only the steady rhythm of forks, knives, and the soft hum of polite conversation that seemed to go on forever, like the pulse of the palace itself. When the meal finally ended, the courtiers stood again, bowed, and withdrew in quiet procession, their movements slow, deliberate, and unhurried. The servants entered once more, clearing the remnants of bread and fruit, their gestures smooth and unbroken, as if performing a ritual known by heart. The king would remain seated for a while longer, gazing absently at the faint play of light on his goblet, lost in thought or in nothing at all. His face, though calm, carried the stillness of someone who lived entirely within the continuity of repetition. A man surrounded by grandeur, but ruled by monotony. The sound of a single fly, buzzing lazily near the edge of the table, became oddly noticeable in that vast, quiet space, its small, aimless motion, a reminder that even in stillness, life persisted in its smallest forms. Afterward, the king would rise, his robes trailing softly behind him as he left the hall. The corridors through which he passed were cool and shadowed now, filled with the faint scent of rushes strewn upon the floor. Outside, the courtyard shimmered with light, and the air was thick with warmth. A few musicians sat beneath an arcade, plucking their lutes in a slow, languid rhythm that echoed softly through the arches, not to entertain, but to accompany the silence. Beyond them, a servant carried a jug of wine toward the shaded loggia, where the queen and her ladies sat embroidering patterns in colored silk. Their laughter was gentle, almost inaudible, like a memory of joy rather than its presence. Noon stretched onward, unbroken by urgency or change. The castle, vast and ancient, seemed to breathe in long, slow intervals, its stones absorbing the heat of the sun, its windows reflecting the sky. The hum of insects drifted in through the open shutters. The banners along the walls stirred faintly in a breeze that barely reached the interior halls. Even the bells in the distant village seemed hesitant to sound, as though they, too, respected the stillness of the royal noon. The king, seated now in the shade of the gallery, might unroll a scrawl brought by his scribe and read a few lines, though his mind would wander before the page was finished. The scent of parchment, the rustle of robes, the faint trickle of water from the courtyard fountain. These were the sounds of his realm at midday, the invisible threads that bound time together. It was a time of balance, of suspension, when the day neither advanced nor receded, but simply lingered. The courtiers, the servants, the guards, all seemed to move in slow harmony, their lives contained within the palace walls, their actions blending into the same eternal pattern of duty and waiting. Outside those walls, the fields shimmered beneath the sun, and the far hills seemed to sleep beneath a veil of light. But within the castle, time folded upon itself, and the noon of the court remained forever the same, bright, quiet, and endless. As the sun began its slow descent from the high blue of noon toward the softer, warmer hues of afternoon, the great palace entered once more into its most drowsy and reflective hour, when sound itself seemed to grow tired, and the movement of people and air alike took on the unhurried rhythm of half-forgotten thought. The walls, warmed by hours of sunlight, seemed to exhale faint warmth into the long corridors, where the light shifted from gold to amber, settling into a quiet stillness that filled every crevice and corner. In the outer gardens, the air was heavy with the scent of thyme and crushed leaves. Bees moved lazily from blossom to blossom, and the hum of their flight seemed to merge with the sigh of the afternoon wind that drifted across the ramparts. Time in those hours did not advance in steps or minutes, but in long, indistinct waves that carried the palace from one breath to the next, as though the entire structure had entered into a kind of waking dream. The courtiers, once alert and attentive during the midday meal, now moved more slowly, their conversation fading into murmurs. Some withdrew to shaded alcoves or the quiet of the library, where the dust and the sunlight hung motionless in the air like suspended time, while others walked the colonnades, their soft footsteps echoing against the stone. In the royal apartments, the king sat near the window, gazing out upon the courtyard, where shadows were beginning to lengthen. His table was cluttered with scrolls, letters, and the remnants of correspondence, though he rarely read them now. The words, written in careful hands by distant officials, blurred into the sameness of duty and repetition. He preferred to sit in silence, listening to the faint rustle of curtains in the wind, and the slow ticking of a small water clock that stood upon the shelf beside him. Each drop that fell echoed faintly, marking time not as urgency, but as the soft, eternal repetition of existence itself. Behind him, the chamberlain moved quietly, sorting through petitions that would never be read. Even the sounds of labor carried a tone of calm, of resignation, of peaceful fatigue. The queen's apartments were filled with the softer murmurs of embroidery and quiet talk. Seated near a window overlooking the gardens, the queen and her ladies worked upon a tapestry, the needle moving in and out of the cloth with patient precision. The design was old, a repeating pattern of vines and flowers, surrounding the likeness of a saint, and though it had been begun years before, it remained unfinished, as though it, too, belonged to the rhythm of endless afternoons. The sound of silk thread slipping through linen mingled with the low hum of voices, with laughter that was gentle and half-hearted, the kind that existed only to keep the silence from deepening too far. Outside the window, the branches of a pear tree swayed, scattering dappled light upon the tiled floor. The queen would sometimes pause to watch the play of sunlight, her eyes following the drifting shapes as though reading a language written in motion. The servants continued their quiet routines. In the kitchens, the cooks prepared the first ingredients for the evening meal, though there was no haste. Pots simmered, knives clicked softly upon wood, and the air was filled with the earthy fragrance of herbs and simmering broth. In the stables, the grooms brushed the horses with slow, steady strokes, their murmured words of comfort blending with the rhythmic swish of straw. In the scriptorium, a monk bent over his work, copying an illuminated text by the light of a small, slanting sunbeam, his pen scratching in the soft silence. Each stroke of ink was deliberate, unhurried, as if meant not to complete but to continue. It was a kind of sacred monotony, a devotion not to progress but to permanence. The castle itself seemed to breathe in time with its inhabitants. The long banners that hung in the great hall shifted faintly in the soft current of air that moved through the open arches, their embroidered lions and crosses seeming almost alive in the wavering light. The walls, thick and ancient, held within them the warmth of centuries. The faint traces of voices, long since silenced, the memory of feasts and vows and quiet prayers whispered in the dark. And yet, in that hour, none of it felt like history. It was simply presence, stillness given form. The guards upon the battlements leaned upon their spears and gazed out across the countryside, where fields rippled faintly in the late sunlight. From the distance came the faint ringing of a shepherd's bell, small and irregular, like a forgotten song. Sometimes, in these quiet afternoons, the king would walk alone through the inner cloisters. The stone beneath his feet was cool, and the columns cast long shadows across the floor. He would trace his hand along the walls, feeling the faint roughness of age beneath his fingers, and listen to the echo of his own footsteps fading into stillness. The sound of his robes brushing the floor accompanied him like a sigh. In the garden beyond the cloister, a fountain played softly, the trickling of water falling upon water, creating a rhythm that lulled thought itself into slumber. A single leaf might fall from one of the tall plane trees, spinning lazily through the air before coming to rest upon the surface of the basin, where it would drift in circles until it slowly sank. Such moments contained more truth than decrees or ceremonies. They were fragments of eternity disguised as ordinary time in the far chambers. The elderly nursemaids tended to the younger children of the court, distant cousins, or guests, whose laughter echoed faintly down the stone corridors, like echoes from another life. Yet even their laughter was subdued, shaped by the hush that governed the palace. The toys of carved wood, the spinning tops and dolls, dressed in scraps of silk, made soft, pleasant sounds as they rolled or tipped upon the floor. One could almost believe that the palace itself smiled at their small, unknowing joy, though only faintly, like a dream of a dream. Outside, the light deepened, turning the sky to the color of honey, and the birds that nested in the eaves began to stir, calling softly to one another, as though marking the slow passage of another day toward its close as the hour lengthened. The warmth of the afternoon settled into the stones and wood, and the palace grew drowsy, as though preparing to sleep again. The courtiers, their duties done for the day, retired to their chambers or the shaded corners of the hall, where they spoke softly or not at all. The sound of a distant lute, carried faintly from an upper gallery, its notes drifting like dust in sunlight, fading almost as soon as they were heard. Time itself seemed to breathe slower, and the air took on the faint scent of rain, though no clouds had yet gathered. In that languid moment, the world existed entirely within the walls of the castle, a small, enclosed eternity of routine and reverence, of silence and sighs. The light upon the stone floors lengthened, stretched, and finally began to fade into shadow. The afternoon was ending, but in its stillness, it seemed eternal, as if the palace would forever remain suspended in that soft, golden hour, neither fully awake nor asleep, but endlessly dreaming of itself. The evening arrived, not with suddenness, but with the same slow inevitability that governed every rhythm of palace life, as though the day, weary from its own length, simply laid itself down upon the stones to rest. The sky above the ancient fortress softened from gold to rose, then to that dim, endless blue which exists only in the brief hour between light and shadow, when the sun's last glow lingers over rooftops and towers. The air, once heavy with the scent of warm herbs and distant fields, grew cooler and thinner, carrying with it the faint perfume of fading flowers and the distant smoke of hearth fires being lit across the valley. Within the walls, the servants moved with a kind of silent ceremony, closing shutters, trimming wicks, and lighting the long rows of candles that lined the great corridors. The faint hiss of flame touching wick, the soft exhalation of new light being born, became the pulse of the building, a slow, repetitive sound that filled the spaces between breath and thought. The king sat still upon his chair, not as a ruler, but as an observer of twilight itself. His hands, resting loosely upon the arms of the seat, felt the cooling air upon their skin, the fine draught that slipped through the casement and carried with it the scent of stone and dusk. In the dimness, his crown caught the last threads of sunlight, glimmering faintly like the memory of a day that no longer truly existed. Around him, the attendants spoke little, their movements almost invisible. A page placed a folded parchment upon the desk. Another poured wine into a goblet. Though the king did not drink, the act of service had become its own quiet ritual. Gestures repeated countless times, their meaning lost, but their comfort preserved. The old chamberlain, who had served 3 kings before him, stood by the doorway, his posture as steady as the pillars themselves. He understood that in these hours, no words were needed. The silence was enough, and it stretched through the room like fabric woven from time itself. Beyond the chambers, the courtyard dimmed, the torches along its walls flickering into small, uncertain life. The sound of footsteps upon gravel echoed briefly, then faded. Somewhere, a stable door closed with a soft thud, and the horses shifted in their stalls. The fountains that had played so merrily in the morning now fell into a slow, rhythmic whisper. Their streams diminished, as if even water sought sleep. The pigeons that had perched upon the high parapets folded their wings and disappeared into the shadows of the eaves, where they would murmur softly through the night. The entire castle seemed to inhale, then exhale, a breath of stone and memory, before sinking deeper into stillness. Inside the great hall, the last of the courtiers gathered for the evening meal. There was little laughter, only the faint murmur of voices softened by distance and candlelight. The tapestries upon the walls seemed to darken as the flames flickered. their woven figures, knights, saints, and ancient kings, half vanishing into the dim. The smell of roasted herbs and warm bread lingered, mingling with the faint sweetness of wine. Yet even the feast had lost its brightness. It was not celebration, but continuation. One more repetition in a cycle too old to question. The servants poured and cleared, moved and bowed, their faces unreadable, their hands precise. The king and queen ate little, speaking in tones so low that only those nearest could hear, though what they said was of no consequence. The court had long ago learned that true power resided not in the words of the living, but in the stillness between them. After the meal, the great hall emptied, leaving behind only the whisper of footsteps and the faint crackle of extinguished candles. The echo of the day retreated up the stairways, through the galleries, past the carved angels and saints that guarded the corridors. In the chapel, a single monk began the evening prayer, his voice low, steady, almost without melody. The words, though ancient, carried the simplicity of breath itself, a rhythm that matched the slow beating of the heart, the steady passage of time. One by one, the candles before the altar were lit, their small flames dancing upon the polished marble, reflected like stars upon water. The king would sometimes come to sit at the back of the chapel, not to pray, but to listen, to lose himself in the monotony of sacred sound. He would close his eyes, and for a moment, the weight of the crown would seem no heavier than a shadow. Outside, the first stars began to appear. They rose above the horizon like the faint glimmer of forgotten promises, their light steady but remote. The towers of the palace stood against the darkening sky like the silhouettes of thought, itself outlines of meaning long since worn smooth by time. The valley below was already cloaked in dusk, the river running through it like a ribbon of dim silver. From distant farms came the faint tolling of bells, marking the end of labor and the beginning of rest. The sound drifted upward, mingling with the sighing of the wind through the battlements, until it became indistinguishable from the deep hum of the world itself. As the last of the courtiers withdrew, the palace became a labyrinth of whispering rooms. The queen retired to her chambers, her attendants moving around her with the slow precision of sleepwalkers. They brushed her hair, folded her gown, and laid fresh linens upon the bed. The faint scent of lavender and beeswax filled the room. She said nothing, only gazed at the single candle beside her bed, watching how the flame bent and straightened with each invisible current of air. In another chamber, the king walked to the window and looked out into the night. The moon had risen, pale, detached, luminous. Its light touched the courtyard, the fountain, the walls, and the sleeping trees, turning them all to the same gentle shade of silver. For a long while, he stood there without movement, feeling neither the chill nor the passage of time, only the weightless presence of being below. In the servants' quarters, the hearths burned low. The sounds of conversation dwindled, replaced by the occasional clatter of a pot, the closing of a wooden door, the soft sigh of blankets being drawn up. Even the dogs had grown still, lying curled by the warm ashes, their breathing steady and deep. The smell of smoke and bread lingered in the air, the scent of endurance, of life continuing without notice. The scribe in the tower extinguished his lamp and set aside his pen, leaving half a line unfinished. It would be waiting for him tomorrow, unchanged, eternal in its incompleteness. The torches in the corridors burned down to glowing embers, their smoke rising in thin, graceful spirals that seemed to write invisible words upon the air. At last, the king turned from the window and walked slowly to his bed. The sheets were cool, the pillows faintly scented with herbs. He lay back, and the silence of the room folded around him like a cloak. In that silence were all the things that could not be said, the years of rule, the weight of decisions, the faces of the long dead. Yet there was no pain in remembering them, only the slow ebb of thought as it dissolved into the rhythm of breath. Outside, the moon climbed higher, casting its light upon the walls, upon the banners, upon the silent kingdom below. The night had claimed its dominion, but it was a gentle rain, full of patience and rest. And so the palace slept, its stones dreaming of sunlit days, its tapestries breathing softly in the dark, its inhabitants adrift in a sea of quiet. The world beyond the gates was forgotten. Within, only stillness remained. The clocks did not tick, the fountains murmured in their sleep, and time itself seemed to have withdrawn into the folds of eternity. In that endless moment, the kingdom existed outside of all change, suspended between the memory of light and the promise of dawn, held forever in the calm, forgiving arms of dusk.